Our final plenary of the day is plenary 3, and Claire McIntosh is going to be chairing this, and it's going to have a bit of breakout activity, so a bit of movement to get the blood flowing. So I'll hand over to Claire.
Okay. Bryony, can you do the slides? Yeah. Wonderful, thank you. Yeah. Okay, so welcome to Plenary 3, which is can we address the challenges? It's been quite an intense, day and several days for those of you that have been in the room for the duration. So this is a chance to have some of those discussions kind of in a more informal setting and get out and articulate some of those burning issues and maybe dig a little bit deeper into some of the things that have come up so far. So next slide. We're going to have 2 breakout sessions in 4 groups, so 2 in person and 2 online. Breakout 1 is really echoing Plenary 1 earlier today. It's thinking about user needs, what kind of things do we need to articulate? And breakout 2 is really thinking more in a systemic fashion and is looking to set up session 4 and 5 tomorrow when we start thinking about what do we need to implement. And this is kind of beginning to think around sort of the practicalities and a little bit of the nuance of what we're thinking about. So in slightly more detail, there are 3 key questions for each. Next question, next slide. So for breakout 1 on user needs and requirements, the first thing to do is please capture who's in the room, where are they using forcing data, or indeed are they data providers, and if so, who do they think is using their data? And I'm not sure if those questions will have the same answer. How might that change with sustained mode? And we've had quite a few hints of that over the last few days, that there is a strong appetite for using data that is much broader than the CMIP fast track or indeed the MIPS. We talk about requirements. I've got a prompt sheet where I've been keeping kind of a running list. I'll show you in a second. What things do we need to consider in terms of requirements, and how is that different depending on the user group? And what's been really interesting is that that is clearly different for different MIPS, as well as for the wider user base. And then what frameworks might be useful across all of the variables that we're talking about in order to kind of characterize the data and have a coherent approach at the sort of variable and data set level. And here, I mean, a lot of my thinking currently is around uncertainty because that's a large part of my job, but it's where do we need common approaches across the data sets? So if we look at the next slide, so this is kind of a prompt sheet. I've just been keeping a list of issues really as they come up. It is not an exhaustive list, but nor is it a list that I expect you to get through in 40 minutes. This is, what kind of things do we want to think about when we're talking about requirements? How do we categorize them? I think Tim's presentation earlier started to drill down into kind of user groups and per variable wish lists and where the commonalities are and where the differences are. Where are the easy wins? And what would you do if you had unlimited funds? And I think capturing both of those would be useful. Next slide. And then the second question is what frameworks might be useful to characterize the data and build on what we have longer term. And here, possibly my professional background is showing things like sampling uncertainty, variability characteristics, certainly going from the pre-satellite to the satellite to scenarios. We've had a lot of discussion about that. It's made me think a lot. Tom Aubrey's slides, forcing uncertainty is as large as internal variability. How do we want to think about that? And I've had a couple of conversations about how we present that information. And here we're talking about kind of high and low uncertainty scenarios. Is it useful to present that in radiative forcing or temperature space? And if so, that's quite an undertaking for people. But it might be more meaningful than saying, well, the volcanic uncertainty is, however many teragrams of SO2. Might be more useful to modelers who want to know, is it worth running a climate model more than once to deal with this uncertainty? That's fundamentally the question you're trying to answer. Diagnostics has come up. The ref is launching for model benchmarking on Monday, I believe. Do we need an analogous approach? What should we have? Documentation is always a thing. Information for implementation. At the moment, there are quite a number of choices that the modeling groups have to make to implement some of these data sets. Again, it depends a little bit per variable. And the bonus question is, what bells and whistles would you add given unlimited resources if you were in charge of the world and it was your problem to spend all of the money you possibly could on this question? Okay, so next slide. Reporting back. You have 40 minutes from when we go. Please be on time, because if we run late, we'll miss the bus and there'll be no dinner. 5 minutes per group to report back. And as I say, we're not expecting comprehensive answers to these questions, but more a representative snapshot of what is in people's minds at the moment when we're thinking about user requirements. There's obviously quite a lot of work for the IPO to do to flesh out kind of where we go from here, but just some beginning steps of what are the really burning issues in people's minds right now. So Bryony has a note on the bottom of this slide. Could everybody who is an attendee in person please get the link from the chat? You're going to do it later? So, yeah. Bryony's going to add a worksheet into the chat that will allow people to follow the discussion on a per breakout group basis. So similar to the Google Sheet we've had running. We're just going to split that up for the breakouts now.
And then once you've got that, I want to ask that all people that are in the room, physically in the room, if you can then leave the WebEx, because otherwise you could be double assigned to an online room when we've already assigned you a in-person room.
Okay. So while Bryony's doing that, if you have a yellow sticker, your breakout group 1, can you stay in this room? And if you have a blue sticker, follow Jane. Your breakout group 2 in the large committee room, follow Chris. He knows where it is. But.
And do these links give us the slides that you just showed?
Yes, if you actually go to the breakout group that you're part of, then on the breakout note, there is a link to the slide deck that Claire just showed. So for Steve's breakout group.
So Tim and Carlo, can you make sure you're leaving the WebEx?
Yellow. Hi, people online. We just want to check that you can hear us.
Yes, I can.
Eleanor, do you want to say something so we can check they can hear you? Can you hear us? Oh no, I need to turn my sound on. Sorry. Oh dear.
I can hear you, yes.
Okay, Steve, could you maybe say hi?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, super, we can.
Good.
Okay, so we've now only got 14, so I think we'll stay all as one group instead of going into 2. So if Steve, you could act as our chair, that would be great.
That would be fine.
And we'll use the Bog 3 Google Doc note, and we'll be...
Oh, Bog 3 or 4?
3.
Okay.
Oh, I was emailed 4, so I will go to 3.
It's just, I think we'll only need one online breakout group. We thought we might need 2.
Okay. Just have to find the link.
It's just in the chat there, just at the bottom, Brian, you put
Still in
it.
the chat. Yeah, okay, there we go.
If anyone's got a problem with bit.ly links, let me know and I can put the Google.
By the way, I mean, just to comment, you have Rachel and I in the same group. Oh, well, we're both online, so it doesn't matter. It's one online group. Yeah, I was going to say. There were 2 online groups we could split up. But...
I don't think we've got enough people to warrant two groups. Yeah.
That's fine. I think eventually we won't have anybody in the room on, right? It'll just be the online folks.
It should be all online now. Yes, I think we managed to chuck.
I mean, we're seeing we're seeing the room, but the room is not, that's irrelevant. Okay, got it.
Yeah.
And you're not in the room, I take it.
No, we're in an interpreter's booth.
Well, hopefully you don't have to do, we'll try to speak understandably, so you don't have to do much interpretation.
Well, let's make a start. So this first session is on how to address user needs and requirements. So there was quite good discussion earlier today in the session we had on user requirements. So it's maybe looking, I think some of the things that Claire had raised were about system requirements, but also the sort of minimum user requirements. So we could go through sort of a certain requirement in the communities that need that. Steve, I'll let you kind of drive how you would like to go through.
Yeah, sure. Let's go around very briefly, one sentence, go around the room to introduce ourselves. So I'll start. I'm Steve Smith in Maryland in the USA at the Joint Global Change Research Institute and also the Center for Global Sustainability at the University of Maryland. So I'm co-PI of the SEDS project and also work on integrated assessment and the connection between the two. So I have a number of arms in this business. I'm just going to go through in order of what I see on my screen just to try. And then Bryony is, I'm sorry, I probably mispronounced that, is supporting us from the.
It's perfect pronunciation. Thank you.
Anything else?
I'm sorry, I meant to introduce myself. I'm so sorry. I was busy typing away. Hi, I'm Bryony Turner. I'm Program Manager for the CMIP IPO, and I'll be pretty quiet in this session and just scribing and typing everything you're saying.
Okay. Anna.
Hi, I feel I'm a bit of an observer here, so I'll mainly be in listening mode, I think. But anyway, I'm a climate scientist based at the Euro-Mediterranean Centre on Climate Change, CMCC in Italy. And I'm particularly interested in making the whole process of delivering the best available science to policymakers. So sustained modes of delivery are very important at all levels in that process, and forcings is part of that picture. So I'm here really to listen in and understand as much as possible the challenges around the forcings data sets.
Okay, great. I'm going to make Eleanor introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Eleanor Rourke. I'm the director of the CMIP International Project Office, and you've possibly seen too much of me this week already.
Certainly not true, but thank you for all you've done to get us together here. Jesus?
Hello, everyone. I'm Jesus Fernandez, or Chus, from the IFCA in Spain, from the University of Cantabria. I'm a regional climate modeler working in Cordex since its inception, nearly 20 years ago. And I will be in the Cordex Science Advisory Team starting in January, and I think I will be with the role of liaison with CMIP7, so I think we will meet several times in the future. So.
Okay, Rachel.
I'm Rachel Hosley. I work with Steve at the Joint Global Change Research Institute in Maryland, and also CGS at University of Maryland. And I also work on SEDS and integrated assessment modeling.
Sebastian.
Hi, I'm based at ECMWF at the Bonn offices, and I'm here mostly with a user perspective from Destination Earth, specifically the global kilometer scale modeling efforts.
Bernd? You're on. Maybe Bernd is not on right now. Bernd Funk. go to Eric.
Hi, I'm Eric. I work at GFDL along with Vaishali and John Dunn. I'm responsible for essentially running the error system model for CMIP7 for the lab, for most of the deck experiments, and also for getting the GHG forcing into the form that the model uses.
Gavin. Maybe Gavin's not on. Vivek? Okay, we may have a couple of people. Anybody else that's wants to chime in that is still okay? Hopefully people will come back to their computers at some point. All right. I think Eleanor, if you would, we're focusing on the user needs and challenges. We've done who's in the room. How do they use, so I think maybe we could go ask anyone how you use the forcing data and how that might change with sustained mode. And I'll just start out in that actually our colleagues for example, the data we produce in SEDS is actually used internally in our integrated assessment model, and also by our simple climate model Hector. So, these data are ingested as historical data for Hector, and also the base historical calibration data for the integrated assessment model. So, I think in sustained mode, essentially, we would just redo those calibrations more often. And we're sort of doing that in a sense for the first time using the set data directly for Hector, and we've already done this for our GChem model. So that's relatively, other than just doing it more often, it's relatively straightforward from here. And it obviously the communication helps that if we add a new sector or something new, or we change a definition, we can communicate that relatively easily. So, but I think I'd mentioned for other integrated assessment modeling groups, those issues of how often are they going to update, or will they use this data to use some other data for historical calibration? I think that's a little open. I don't know if everyone uses our data or other data sets. So I think that's an interesting question to ask. But I do think that for the integrated assessment models, one of the big points is that with sustained mode and continual historical updates, it becomes more useful to develop machinery to be comparing your model outputs, because the model base year is often not going to keep up with the data. So you've got essentially what is to the model future data that you can compare to make sure the model's on the right track. So that's something we all tend to do. And with sustained mode, we would have more data more often to do that with. Who else wants to talk about how they would use the data, especially differently in sustained mode? Sebastian or Jesus?
I mean, Destination Earth is a relatively recent activity. So we've just finished our first round of simulations, and there we relied on basically the same setup as what CMIP models would have been using in CMIP6, so historical and scenarios. For me, an open question is really what sustained mode means in detail, because that would very much determine how Destination Earth will be able to use it. So I think to me that there are two aspects. One is our biggest focus is on scenarios. So for that, the question to me is a bit, what's the plan for sustained production of scenarios? And I think it's what we have to think about is what's the value of updating scenarios more frequently, if that's what a sustained mode means. If it actually adds value, if we update scenarios once a year, whether it adds a lot of computational demand because we have to rerun scenarios without adding any actual value. And then for the historical, I think a regular extension would be very welcome. because for one type of simulation that we run, our so-called story 9 simulations, where we nudge the large-scale flow to observations, this makes sense or more sense if we have historical forcing up to date to provide greenhouse gas concentrations and so on. And these two I would see a bit separately, because the historical as a basically initial condition for the scenario, I think we wouldn't want to update very often, but the historical to look at recent extreme events, if that's updated or extended regularly, that would be very beneficial. What came up in the discussion this morning as well was updating the historical, so also changing the forcing for previous years, and that I again see a bit critical, because it would require rerunning the simulations, and as destination Earth runs are quite expensive with 5-kilometer resolution, there would have to be a good reason for rerunning. If it's just about fixing some minor thing that doesn't have an effect on the simulated climate, it will put us in a difficult situation to say there is a more updated historical forcing. It's better than what was there before, but the effect in terms of simulated climate is negligible. So I think that's a bit of a communication challenge then, if we would decide not to use it, if it's, on the other hand, the most recent best forcing.
And were you here for Monday when we talked about this new CMIP? So given the cost of your simulations, because for the long-term climate models, they're still expensive, but not as expensive as what you're doing, it sounds like. So for them, what they've said, yeah, actually running a few extra years every year to, get from updated 2022 to the present, that's no problem. We would just do that. But how about from your perspective?
So if we're talking about, well, if I remember correctly, that will mean we have a historical simulation going up to, well, let's say 2014 for the sake of it. And now there are additional 5 years of historical forcing that have become available. Adding these 5 simulated years is not a problem also for our simulations. The problem would be if we have to rerun several decades of simulation. So if there's 1 year or 2 years being added, we would do that immediately.
And everyone has the same problem really for the longer time period. And it's actually double, because it's not just relearning the longer time period, but if you have a significant change in the historical period, then you have to recalibrate. You may have to recalibrate your model. For example, if your model energy balance doesn't match observations, which all the GCMs, of course, and probably what you as well do, then you have to go in and figure out how to fix that, because that's not really acceptable for a modeler to have that number wrong. Yeah, and so.
Yeah.
Okay, sounds like it's a very similar space, so that's good. We don't have to create a different category for your use case. Jesus, do you have any comments? We can't hear you. You're muted.
Sorry. Regarding the sustained delivery, in the way the protocols are going currently in Cordex, which is in fact quite similar to CMIP, that we prepare for a long time, and then we have to start doing the simulations for an even longer time. I don't find a specific advantage of having this sustained delivery, and more on the support of these products, that if there is any problem that is fixed or something like this, but we are not in a position to repeat with a new forcing the whole simulation, the whole set of simulations, because this is really costly at this resolution, and with the amount of simulations. Maybe we could do some small experiments with other forcings or something like this.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But what I saw important in this meeting is that it was quite enlightening, in fact, for me to assist to this meeting, because with the regional climate models, there are 2 paths to develop these kind of models. One is coming from the GCMs and just change the grid so they run on a regional domain. And another one is to use a numerical weather prediction mesoscale model and let it run for a longer time as a climate model. And I think the groups that work from the perspective of the global climate models that has been move to a regional domain, they are much more aware of this, of all of these forcings, because many of them are not being used in Cortex at the moment. For instance, after the Monday session, I ran a quick survey on the RCM groups in Cortex about for instance, the solar forcing. If anyone was modifying the solar constant along with this 11-year solar cycle and so on. And many of the groups, they just have a constant solar constant. Total radiation is a constant. And the groups which they have an in-house GCM, which is involved in CMIP, they were already using this. So we need even more communication within Cortex to really make use of all of the forcings to make them as compatible as possible with CMIP. And like this, many other things, because the different RCMs are developed independently. They use different land use data sets, for instance, and it would be nice if we could synchronize our land use to use exactly the same as the global models are using, with this harmonized land use, and of course changing in time, which this is still pending. So even if we cannot benefit from, or in principle we cannot benefit from this sustained mode, for sure we will benefit from more coordination with this forcing testing.
Okay, great. Gavin, welcome. If you give a one-sentence introduction, and then I'll repeat the question we're addressing for you to.
Sorry, yeah, we have a headquarters site visit happening today.
We understand.
Yeah, Gavin Schmidt, I'm the director of the Goddard Institute for Space Studies, but here I'm really the PI for the GISS climate model. So in CMIP6 it was GISS E2.1, E2.2, and in CMIP7 it will be GISS E3 and E4. And so I'm leading the group that's developing that and running those simulations. And so I'm very interested in how to do that most efficiently. And I'm in my kind of slightly different hat. I do a lot of communication on climate change issues, and I've been quite concerned about our inability to explain what's been going on in any kind of quantitative way over the last couple of years. And so we set up the Series MIP project, which is a kind of a CMIP6 plus activity that we're hoping to be able to use to understand the changes in the series data, but that also helps with the attributional part for temperature changes and extremes. So that's my overall interest.
Okay, and then the question we're going around the room on now, so I think we're actually to you, is how would you use forcing data differently in the sustained mode?
So the key thing that we really want to be able to do is to do extensions past the historical, past the end of the historical runs. So keeping things up to date for the historical ensemble, but also the DA MIP ensemble. So that would be the historical solar, historical volcano, historical GHG, historical aerosol, so that we'd be able to do both the standard kinds of DA type activities, but also the anything that is particularly special, for hist-vol, right? Can we get a hist-vol protocol that includes the water vapor that came in from Hunga Tonga? Can we have a hist-air protocol that that we turn on and off the marine shipping changes? And see what difference any of these particular small things. And then biomass. Biomass doesn't really fit into the DA MIP protocol, because you don't know whether it's anthropogenic or human, but we need to be able to test, what are the impacts of, big biomass burning type of things. And, some of that is trivial, right? Running an extra year of the historical ensemble would take, like a couple of days. Some of that is a little bit more involved if you want to get down into the weeds. But I think that as a climate science community, it is imperative for us to do science that is responsive to questions that we are getting from both the general public and decision makers and politicians. And I am getting, and I have got literally hundreds of requests to discuss that or explain why we can't discuss it over the last 6 months, and we have to be able to respond to that.
Right, and I think just, I guess, editorial comment is in the last intervening, I don't know, 5-7 years, my perception, but you would know better, that the DA sort of science has really evolved a lot so that you can actually think about doing this, whereas we were more on the edge of that at the end of CMIP6. Is that correct to say?
I mean, I think so. I think the expectation for CMIP6 was that there would be annual updates. I certainly recall that being discussed. But I think it's the facts on the ground that have changed, that have pushed this up the priority list. The fact that temperature changes have been dramatic, and that we are seeing somewhat odd behavior in Antarctica. We're seeing odd behavior in the North Atlantic, and you know, and our work and our efforts. You know, I think we used to think that climate was a long-term thing, and we'd only be looking at the long-term trends, and we'd only and that, you know, and this kind of 10-year cadence of updating things was mostly fine. But we've also had, you know, the scenarios becoming becoming out of date, and you know, this whole discussion about RCP 8.5 and you know, a lot of nonsense that was talked about along those lines. But those scenarios were designed, you know, 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so, you know, people are asking us, you know, what's your best guess for what's going to happen? And we say, oh, you know, SSP 2.5, and it's like, but you know, it doesn't have COVID, right? It doesn't have.
Yeah, I just want to interrupt just so we can get around to some other folks if needed. But just on that scenario point that Sebastian also brought up, I think it is important to think about what's the use case for continuous update of scenarios. You know, up to a point, just reharmonizing the scenarios is potentially a relatively low work activity. Obviously it needs to be funded, but it's not rerunning all the IAMs. So just to get the latest consistency with history and going a bit into the future, but at some point things become broken, right? If the history is really not matching the starting point of the IAM anymore because you have more coal plants or less coal plants than you had in your scenario, then the scenario really loses its usefulness. Yeah, so Rachel, since you didn't want to pass by you, do you have anything you wanted to add? You're muted.
Wait to comment later.
Okay, and then I saw a couple new people. Eric, are you online?
Yes, I'm still here.
And just give a sentence and about you, and then if you have any reflections on this question we're addressing.
So yeah, I mean, I'm a GFDL, you know, so in sort of my CMIP7 hat, I feel like you know, this is kind of this sustained mode doesn't I don't want to say it doesn't really come into play, but we really sort of want to focus on having something locked in at a given date. And once that happens, I think we're relatively reluctant to want to resubmit runs, even if that's as you've brought up, that, you know, things diverge from what the ground truth is in terms of scenarios. Having said that, you know, CMIP isn't the only function of the lab. I know it's a big part of my function at the lab, but for other people, I think there would be some utility in having updates on a more frequent basis. And just as somebody who has spent a lot of time in the software world, having an increase in automation for these pipelines is something that I definitely celebrate, because at a minimum, it makes it easier to plug into our pipelines. So just anything that kind of smooths out that that process is good for us.
Okay, Bernd or Vivek, are you either of you back on? If not, Stefano, are you on? Looks like you joined, but not.
We've got 5 minutes, so you might want to perhaps look at maybe the user requirements and the communities needing those requirements, or the system requirements, one of those.
Yeah. I guess there's a whole list of things here. I mean, and if you look at the slide, there's a list of things on breakout 1, and the link was just posted in the chat. There's everything extension versus update. I think we've addressed that a bit. Latency requirements. I think consistency for seeing data sets. I'm not sure if that's how relevant that is. We did. I guess maybe I'd bring up particularly this latency requirement or latency issue, I might say. You know, for updating every year, if we're doing, and I think from the SED's perspective, certainly we would do an extension and an update. So it will become clear, and that's one of the things we can do is say, okay, here's the areas where our best estimate of reality is diverging from our extension, right? And then groups can figure out whether that is relevant to whatever they're doing or not. I don't know, any other issues? Yes, Stefano. And Sebastian, sorry.
I think on the timeliness of the extensions, it's more than just thinking about whether reality diverged from what we assumed in the scenarios, because as Gavin mentioned, for attribution type questions, it's highly relevant to have the recent past covered up to present day. Of course, you could use scenarios and say that's a good approximation of actual historical forcing, but I think that's the most urgent application, really, where we look at questions about understanding recent events and putting them into context. So I think that, and the sooner the updates arrive, or not updates, extensions, that should be precise, the better. But something like annual frequency to me sounds doable.
I think that's a really good point, and I'm just going to repeat it to highlight it for our notes, is that, yeah, an important use of the extensions and updates sustain mode is to have a more up-to-date evaluation of across multiple dimensions of where reality is not matching the scenarios. And I think that's a very good point. And that doesn't necessarily have to have anything with climate models, although the climate models could obviously be used to evaluate the importance of any such difference. Any other thoughts? Yeah, Gavin.
Yes, I mean, on the question of latency, you know, we've thought a little bit about this, and talking to some of the other kinds of groups, so the decadal prediction folks, the seasonal prediction folks, and the reanalysis folks, the needs for latency is different for each of those groups, and there isn't a one size fits all. For the CMIP6, for the CMIP class models, so GFDL, GIS, NCAR, you know, EPSL, and all the rest of it. You know, if you could, if we had like a commitment to have like a 0th order extension, you know, by 6 months after the end of a year, I think that would be fine. That would allow us to go back, give updates in a relatively timely manner, and the running of the extensions for the modeling groups is not you know, it would take, you know, a week to for everybody to get onto it if they had a commitment to do so, and so I think that would be fine, and then that would like lead into, you know, was that available for the COP meetings? Was that available
Right.
for the WMO State of the Climate update? So like that 6-month period to get everything all lined up is a good time period for that. For the other groups, like the decadal simulation people, they generally start their runs in October or November, and they want to have everything kind of up to date until then. Again, that fits with their timetable to have updated things up until that moment, and then like you can have either continuations or modeled estimates of how things move going forward into the future. One of the interesting things was that in the failure to predict how warm 2023 was, the initialized predictions did just as badly as the statistical models based just on ENSO and the long-term trends. Everybody failed, and it's possible that failure was in fact related to the fact that people had not updated the forcing data sets appropriately.
Okay. Any other comments on that
Good
point?
question. Yeah. So, okay. So like I'm envisioning doing like a SEDS update every year where we have an update and an extension of the CMIP7 data, right? We wouldn't have extensions of the updates because then you would be maintaining like 5 different data sets. But like at a certain, like sometimes these like the historical energy rewrites are sometimes like quite significant, or like just the emissions rewrites in general, right? And so after a couple of years, like if you look at the differences between like the kind of CMIP6 plus data set that we have now and the CMIP6, like they're quite historical differences, right? And at what point is this just like a start over every 7 or 8 years when the next CMIP comes along? Like at a certain point, like, and I know that it's all circumstantial, right? Sometimes they're going to be big changes and sometimes they're going to be small changes that don't matter, and we really can just keep extending the CMIP7 data. But like at what point does it become important, and like when do you just like scrap it and start over? Like there are just like lots of things to think about. Yeah.
I was just going to comment quickly that there may be specific regional implications or sectoral implications for certain types of modeling. So that's where I think documenting the changes is important, because then those people addressing, if you're looking at a region and air pollution changed dramatically, well, you really want to update for your region, right? Or else you're not going to get the right answers. So I think it comes really points to documenting those differences, perhaps. Sebastian.
I would say the question when to really update or switch over to an updated forcing data set is not a question of a sort of regular time period, but rather whether there are differences that require switching over. And I think from the destination Earth perspective, as soon as some to be defined criteria for what is the difference that is large enough to switch over, we would have to. But then it also depends what the majority of the CMIP community would do, because once we switch over, we lose contact to the models that do not switch over, and they provide really necessary context to our simulation. So I think that is a challenge, and the best solution would be to find something as a community together, define criteria for switching over. But that also means to have the resources to then do the simulations, which I'm not in a position to comment on.
Right, but I think that's a pin for future is defining that is sort of a learning by doing thing. I think that the community will have to figure out as we go along in this new mode, right, Gavin? Very good point.
So I mean, let's talk specifics. Bernd's on here. So the solar forcing. We actually have a pretty stable solar forcing for the instrumental period, at least for the last few decades. So the updates for that, so the extensions for solar forcing, basically you just need to know where you are in the solar cycle and how big that cycle is, and you can have a pretty good thing. So we could be looking, we could have been using the updates to the CMIP, the extensions to the CMIP6 for the extension runs with not that much problems, but the update to the solar there's been a lot of revisions to the early sunspot record, which means that there have been large changes in the 19th century and the early 20th century. And so that matters, but for a different reason, right? So that matters if we're going to redo the whole historical thing. But we would have been okay with the extensions just using the extended CMIP6, and the changes that we would have got in the stratosphere or wherever for this modern period, that would have been fine, because we would have had a stable run to work from, even though the update had much bigger changes much earlier on in the record.
Okay. I think we got some really good insights out of this. We have, I don't know, probably 30 seconds or a minute. Kevin, go ahead. Okay.
Just one more comment. You were talking about maybe a 6-month timeline for some of that data set, the data sets updates or extensions. And just to comment on SEDS, the data that we need for the extensions don't come out until July. So for the year before. So a 6-month time frame is not necessarily doable for us.
But slightly after is.
Yeah.
But then another major data set comes out in September. So the better update comes out in the fall. So yeah, it's trade-off. All right. I think they may be calling his name, but Jesus, if you have a quick comment.
Just to switch for a second the conversation from the time dimension to the spatial dimension. So could you give some feedback regarding the increase of spatial resolution in these forcings? What would this entail? Is it a matter of having a high resolution observations, or for instance, so I have no idea of these integrated assessment models, what exactly they need to provide a more detailed spatialization of the scenario,
Yeah, I think,
for instance, for land use?
In terms of the sustained forcing, the resolution would be roughly the same, because we're just building on what we did before. And increased resolution would be a fundamental change to the data, which probably will happen, right? I mean, there's always calls for increased resolution. So I think increasing the resolution of the data is a step change in the data, fundamentally changing it, and that would be expected to happen, but that wouldn't be sort of, then that may enter into the sustained mode later. That would be my reaction to that, I think. Eleanor, are you calling us out back?
Yeah, I think we should maybe try and just get the 3 feedback points, because then we'll need to head back into the main plenary with everyone else and feedback and discussion.
Okay. Well, everybody's welcome to open that document to help with that process. Thank you.
Okay, so we have any ideas of the kind of key points there out of that discussion? You know, in terms, it sounded like there wasn't necessarily a drive for annual, and that it was more reflective of when there was a need for updates. Is that interpretation correct?
I think, yeah, and annual updates seem to be the consensus that would be helpful for those purposes that need them. Yeah, or annual extensions as well as updates.
Extensions, yeah.
And then another key point was the need in the future for the community to develop metrics to determine at what points, when the extensions deviate from our best new guess of actual, start to become big enough that we need to restart, or it points to that. So I think that's sort of an ongoing need, which we don't have a clear idea of yet.
There's also kind of the same point about scenarios, like at what point are the beginning of the scenarios so wrong that you need to have new scenarios? Yeah.
But also that's a new point. Yeah, that related to that is that the sustained mode helps evaluate how far off track scenarios are. So in this near term, obviously, if it's off track for a year, but after you get a few years of extension, some of the scenarios will start to be more unrealistic, and that's very important to identify, and that will be across many dimensions of forcing. That would be important to note. Yeah, and I think that's part of the sustained mode evaluation that the community can start thinking about now. So I think that was a really strong point. Yes, thank you, Rachel.
Okay, I think we should head back into the room. So we'll move back into the room, and then Steve, if you're able to just sort of summarise those key feedback points to the main room when we head back in.
Those are captured just at the top of the document, just underneath the list of names. And all of you do feel free to make any corrections. We're just note takers in this situation. Okay. Right, bear with us. We physically have to move. So
Yeah,
we'll mute
okay.
ourselves.
Well, thank you very much for supporting this. That's very, very helpful. So we're all still here until they're going to go and join us back to the main room. So we're free to chat. So in that document, that BOG 3.
We had an interesting discussion. Of course, we could talk for much longer, but we heard about user requirements, annual updates for the indicators project, and the sort of greenhouse gas concentrations, a whole lot of stuff needed to run these models and give an annual update. We discussed the timing of those updates and something ideally having the data ready by March for the previous calendar year. Something like this would enable things to be done. So that is, at the moment it's working, but actually not always completely, and sometimes gaps have to be filled and so on. And so if some things could just be accelerated a little bit, that would add value. Discussion on RFMIP was the other thing that Chris mentioned, and there the issue of compatibility between the fast track and then the later community MIPs, and not wanting inconsistencies in the forcing data sets for there. So I think we were reassured that's going to be okay. And then we got on to a very interesting discussion on reharmonization. So if we are doing annual updates of historical data, that's fine. We also have the scenarios, and how do we match that? Zeb told us, and it was news probably to some people, that the people who do all of this reharmonization, that they have to do it at least once for matching the scenarios to historic data. The idea of repeating that every year is not a terrifying prospect, because the workflow has been improved. There's a lot of automation involved. Once you've got all the software set up to do it, then it can be done. And yes, we were explained indeed how that's the case. So we were starting to discuss the use cases of that. What, do all scenarios need to be reharmonized every time? How far out do things need to go? Do you need to go out the full sort of century of data every year? Who would use that data? The main use case for this are the decadal prediction community, maybe seasonal prediction, reanalysis, people who want to know just the next few years, and having that being consistent. We also discussed whether, in fact, there was value of not just reharmonization, but rerunning the whole sort of scenario process based on how things have developed, so that making use of the updates in the actual historical data, rerunning scenarios, maybe taking account of policy changes, things like that. There was an argument made this actually would be quite a useful thing to do. Also, perhaps more on the sort of policymaker discussions, running simplified the climate models and so on, and having those being up to date with actually what is happening now, rather than just what was, the situation 5 or more years ago. That might not then feed into, running big climate models, or certainly not all the user applications and so on, and impacts community. But that could be discussed further. So we were discussing that harmonization being done annually versus even more ambitious things annually, And we sort of ran out of time at that point, I think, was roughly where we got to. And then Claire asked at the end a little bit about just the properties of why places like ECMWF might want to use CMIP data and what are the characteristics that were valuable for that. And that's interesting because it's a combination of traceability, respectability, but also the quality, and the quality is assumed to be good at the time it's done. But of course, if it gets very out of date, then that suffers. Stop there.
Brilliant, perfectly on time. Thank you very much. Jane is next on my list.
Okay, so Chris can chime in if I kind of miss anything key here as well, or anyone else who's in the working group. We had quite a lively discussion. So we were mainly a group of modelers, and so primarily probably I would say a CMIP heavy group with Carlo representing non-CMIP users, and we had some data providers there as well, so that was quite useful. I think the main thing that probably came out of our discussion was the desire for the annual updates of the extensions, and we identified many use cases for that, particularly in the detection and attribution space, the seasonal forecasting systems, and things like the annual updates of forcings. There was a kind of an interesting discussion around what level of quality that data needs to be, and the kind of encouragement of maybe having a kind of a beta or a provisional product, and recognizing the potential benefits of having that maybe slightly, not finalized or perfected product, but how that might be appropriate or suitable for some of these use cases. There was I would say a request from the data provider side in terms of having more information from the users in terms of what forcing data sets were needed on that annual update timescales, and what level of information within that. So do we need all the information by sector, for instance? And perhaps that might not be needed on those faster timescales. So I think we didn't quite get to the point in our discussion of actually hammering out what those data sets were and going by sector. It was clear that maybe some applications we were talking in, like in the ESM world, we still make use of some of those sectors, not all of them, but it is useful to have that information. But maybe other applications, particularly maybe in the seasonal and decadal, they're not maybe so interested in that. So I think maybe we thought maybe one of the outcomes from the workshop could be that we could think about as the community maybe actually penning down what those are and feeding into that, but we didn't quite have time in that space. We were talking about also consistency in data sets and the kind of production line. Paul raised the production line process and having a particular version and then a new updated version coming in, and there might be overlap in terms of those versionings, and that could be potentially quite useful, having that overlap period. We did then tap a little bit into the harmonization side of things towards the end, and maybe putting together a kind of a framework around that, and kind of a framework basically to deal with that regular requirement for when you're doing the annual updates, how to do the harmonization. So basically pulling together the machinery to build that system. And I think that was most items, I think. If I've missed anything, Chris? Okay, I'll leave it there.
Brilliant, thank you. I think the next person on my list is Anka to report.
No,
who was?
One online group.
Oh, we've only got one online group, so Steve Smith then.
Yes, so not inconsistent with some of the previous. I think the consensus was that annual extensions are sufficient for those who need it. There was a bit of a sub-point that, sort of early summer is the earliest time to do many of these extensions, to get some can happen earlier, some can't happen until then. But then, so that works well for many use cases, get the earliest possible date for the extension. There are some use cases that tend to spin up in the fall. So those would more readily use an extension that was done in the fall, which could be done with a bit more fidelity because you have more data on the previous year. So that's one subtle point there. So there needs to be, so as we do extensions and we march these forward in time, of course, these will diverge from sometimes from our best estimate of what actually happened. So there is going to be a need for the community to have some consensus on how you evaluate that, and at what point does that become important enough that you need to redo something more consistently. Maybe not from pre-industrial, but maybe back a little bit further or something like that. So that's a point that is interesting. And then the third primary point is that the extensions and updates are useful to evaluate at what point reality is diverging from one or more of the scenarios, or maybe vice versa. So at some point, so I think that's a second point where we want to evaluate that, and that's something I don't think has come up before. That's a useful. The sustained mode means we have regular data at which to evaluate the scenarios against, and I think that's been done before, sort of informally, but it's not been available for all the different forcings. For something like global CO2, that's done pretty readily because that's easily updated, but the others are not so much with the other forcings. And then for both of those above points, it points to the need for evaluation and documentation of how extensions deviate from any new best estimates of historical forcings, and perhaps at some point of the consequences. And that gets back to this question that was brought up of, do you turn these into forcing space somehow so you can compare them? And then also for these points, what's important can and likely will differ by region. So for example, the starting point for air pollutant emissions in a particular region turns out to be very different than what was previously assumed. And that will likely happen because there's many regions where we just don't have really good solid data. And even in some regions where we think we do, we may not turn out to have. So new data may need to be used for analysis focused on that region. Any other points from any of the participants?
Okay, thank you. We've got a couple of minutes if there are any burning questions. Otherwise, we'll go into the next breakout session. Yep, Louise.
Not so much a question, more of a comment about whether or not annual updates to harmonization was terrifying. I don't think it's terrifying, but it is time consuming. And so I think it would definitely need like a sustained mode of funding, and it would be a significant part of somebody's effort to do that on a regular basis. So yeah, it's not terrifying, it can be done. And I think we're getting set up in the CMIP7 process to really streamline that, I think, and so we'll be able to leverage that in the future, but it's historically it has been a time-consuming process. Thanks.
Okay, Brian, are you able to share slides? Okay, so after this one you get dinner, which is the good news. I think everybody's feeling the length of the day. This session is more about how we start to think about the kinds of things that we need in place in a more sort of systemic fashion. And so echoing really Plenary 2, what kind of decisions will we need to think about making? What external bodies do we need to coordinate with? So we have, we heard from the funding bodies, we heard from user groups that, these data sets have a massively large reach, some of them. Can we leverage that? And some of the practicalities. So the next slide has, again, just a few prompts, and this will be also freeform. But how do we think about which data sets are the CMIP data sets? Does that stay as incumbency forever? Do we need to have some sort of evaluation process? What happens if that is in conflict with requirements from funding bodies? How do we begin to think about that? Who should be making those decisions? How do we decide how to include new data sets? How can we be sure that we're getting the right information from people? User requirements, the kind of data you produce depends on knowing what it is that is needed in very many ways. Who from, where is our boundary of users? Is it only CMIP? Is it wider? How do we think about the MIPS as opposed to the fast track? We're not going to answer those today, but there's things that need to be on our radar if we're starting to think about coordination and approaching funding bodies. Again, external bodies, so upstream data provision, that's come up a number of times. There are some known pain points. There are some very well-established data sets, and there are some that are operating on a shoestring. Can we advocate for them? Can we organize? I think Tim's point about organizing earlier was really, really critical here. Is this a model where if we're going to spend this effort building it as a community, do we want to think across what is called the WCRP modeling multiverse at things like the digital twin Earths, kilometer scale modeling? How do we interact with the wider WCRP and wider Earth system modeling? And then some system practicalities, which is what Zeb touched on, that the sort of absolute minimum viable effort that you can build a data set on is 1 FTE postdoc, and a number of these data sets do not have that on a sustained fashion currently. That's our minimum, but what do you actually need to have something that you could consider sustainable as a data provider? Can we leverage sort of aggregating the use cases to make the case that the data doesn't happen by magic, it requires sustained effort. And then how do we think about archives? How do we think about long-term storage? The ESGF is not designed for long-term storage. Somebody is going to need to think about that at some point. Equity of access has come up a few times, and that is equity of access to data building as well as to the actual data itself. And again, unlimited funding functionality, I usually put on these kinds of events because it is interesting to just take away that constraint. If you weren't constrained by money, what size group would you need to do a good job? So go and get a glass of water on the way out to your respective breakout groups. And we'll see you back here in 40 minutes for the final roundup.
That would bring us back at 55.
Okay, so 30 minutes?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks.
Is the bus not till 7, so we could keep everyone working much longer? Do you want to do 40 minutes then?
Should we do 30 minutes? Because I think everybody's getting tired. I don't want to be the person that makes it longer.
Okay, so 30 minutes. We'll reconvene here at 5:45.
Oh, and hang on, we swapped people though, so I should be.
Are the group the same?
The groups are the same. The chairs are not the same. So yellow stickers go out, blue stickers stay in here or whatever.
Okay. I don't know where Eleanor is, but she's not sitting next to me, but she is here somewhere. But you've definitely got me. I'm ready to record your discussion. So who's the chair for the second session? Let me check my slides. Oh, Gavin. Gavin or Rachel, you can decide between you which one of you will chair, because we've only got one breakout room online.
I'm
Gavin
happy to let
had
Gavin do it if he's here.
Gavin had to. Oh, he's here. Is he back? He was going to step out for lunch. Grab his lunch.
Okay, well, if Gavin's not here, I'm happy to do it.
Super, thank you.
All right. Okay, so I mean, this is the same bunch of people, so we won't have to do introductions. And I guess we can just start jumping into the topics that were on the slide. So just a real quick overview. So how to build a sustained mode delivery program at the group level, what decisions need to be made, where do we need to coordinate with external bodies, and practically speaking, what do we need to consider? And then a lot of other points. How do we decide which data set is used for each variable? How often do we revise it? Who is the appropriate group to decide this? How do we decide to include new data sets? How do we ensure we're gathering user requirements efficiently? Upstream data provision communities advocate for input data sets that are identified as at risk. What about other data users? Can we join forces? The WCRP modeling multiverse. And then can we leverage the very wide user base and reach of these data sets, and how do we organize that? And then system practicalities of how do we do this? How do we ensure continuity of expertise? What's needed at the minimum? The interface between research and operations, how do we manage that? Archive, long-term storage, equity of access considerations, and unlimited funding, what would we do? Does anyone want to start with thoughts? Steve, you're muted.
There we go. Thing that stood out to me is how many times we heard, yeah, we're leveraging other things, like what Louise said. And if you're doing that once every 5-6 years, which is what we've been doing, people can get away with that.
Yeah.
But the funding is absolutely critical for sustained mode, because you can't just leverage your way every year. So there's funding, and then in some cases perhaps staffing. Some of the groups, maybe when it's a research project, they can do it every few years, but if not, they might have to hire staff, and does their institution support that? They'd have to work that out with their institution. So or maybe get some cross-institutional collaboration. That certainly has I've seen that work. So
yeah,
there's
I
somebody who's
agree
actually
that comes up all the time, and that is, I think, the most obvious first biggest hurdle to not just sustain mode, but I mean the journey to sustain mode, which is just updating more often. Yeah. One thing that I've been thinking about is kind of that, right? There's like the ideal sustain mode and what that looks like and how it's organized with everybody doing everything and everybody staffed and funded, and like how you organize all of that together. And then there is like how you get there. And I guess it just starts with like having constant funding and being able to update a little bit more often. And I think we're a little bit farther ahead on that on SEDS than in a better position than some of the other data sets. But like the first step is just everybody trying to update a little bit more often. So how do you coordinate that when you're like not quite at your kind of end goal of like what sustained mode looks like? I think that poses a lot of like near-term challenges on coordination. Anybody?
how to get from here to there.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I feel like the intermediate poses different challenges than the final goal does. Not that there aren't enough challenges in the final goal, there certainly are, but there are different considerations in the near term when we're trying to get there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Uh-oh, that must have been Eleanor.
Yep. Anyone have any other thoughts?
There might just be three of us here right
Yeah.
now.
I mean, Steve and I can just like go back and forth in our little echo chamber, but
You want to perhaps, as you're coming up with your points, because we've got a bit of a structure from Claire, just make it clear if it's decision making at the community level, coordination of external bodies and system practicalities, and then we'll note. So don't worry if your ideas are flowing in different ways, but just let us know so we know.
Yeah, I think this. So one of Rachel's points, I think, was with this. When we're getting from here to there's some community level coordination in terms of we're not doing annual updates quite yet. Then, if things are, maybe we need some synchronization in the near term.
So how do you think that could maybe happen, Steve? Like in terms that you said that you've seen, for example, sharing of staff across institutions.
Well, it gets to the logistics and I mean, for example, sometimes, it's easier to share staff than money um, to work on something, and other times it's easier to share money, right? So it really just depends on the institutional and infrastructure challenges. So for example, for some of the data sets, they might not need a full staff person to work with, say, a PI that's at a university. They really don't have means to support like somebody to do that, but maybe a national laboratory or some other place has a staff person and some funding that could, they could spend 20% of their time a year or whatever it takes to help facilitate and, turn the cranks and do the vetting and so on to help get the data set updated and so on. So that's like a model that, might work sometimes, or yeah, so I think it's going to just be individual circumstance. And then there may be the need for help from, not everybody is as adept at sort of navigating, funding, staffing, and making all that happen.
Do you think it could be useful to have a better kind of idea of resourcing going to sort of elements of each data set delivery? Because as you say, it might be there's not a full-time person that needs to do that sort of publication element or the preparation. Because I don't feel that that's that clear for all of the data sets. So then it's difficult to have these discussions about how to pool effort.
I suspect you're right. And I think it'll vary by data set. For the land use, well, if we could get Louise X% of her time covered every year, we'd probably be all very happy with that because we'd get a data set, it would be good, and we don't, that would solve the problem. For some of the other data sets, maybe it's not that simple. I don't know.
Do you think, sorry, Bryony here just was as a lull, but on that point, some of that is not just about having the resources, but even if you have the resources, you need specifically skilled people to do that. So are there too many single points of weakness to be able to do this in a sustained mode? Is that something that needs to be thought about sort of mentoring more people through?
Well, that connects a bit with the point I was making earlier today about, sort of software engineering skills and so on. The person that comes up with the novel new idea to create this data set you know, is not necessarily the same person that has the skills to build, you know, a workflow to make it repeatable consistently. But, you know, then you have to be very careful about just credit and attribution, right? And it's not you know, we want to make sure people's sort of intellectual inputs are recognized and they have control over that and all these related issues, right? And do you want to talk? I think there's also this issue of multiple data sets, and I think the biomass burning is a great example, right? There's a number of data sets out, and with the models getting endogenous fires, essentially they're all their own independent data set now. We're getting toward that. And some of them are literally that, I think, right, where there's a version that's a fire model and they're producing a data set, and then there's the interactive version within the model. So I think that's a good example to explore how the community, but also historically, these data sets are produced by whoever stepped up to do it. So, you know, we really appreciate that, you know, various groups step up and actually do this, right? Eking out their time and resources in some cases to make it happen. So I think there's that balance to be discussed. But maybe it comes down a lot to evaluation and when multiple data sets exist to make sure there's some resources to evaluate alternative data sets and their differences. Because you'll learn a lot doing that.
At at a certain level, I feel like it's up to that's like less a larger CMIP forcing community issue and more of like the data type community issue. Right. So like one thing that is challenging to me as someone who doesn't have a background in climate modeling or air quality modeling or many of these other forcing data sets that we're talking about is that I have this like niche little expertise in emissions inventories, and I have very little knowledge of everything else that's going on with the other forcing data sets, except that I know that they're important. And so and like when we're talking about like the usability of one data set versus another data set and you know x different models making different data sets, that is like I feel like that's almost like the responsibility of the like fire data community to figure out like those metrics, right?
I think where such a community exists, yes. And maybe the community or the CMIP, the task team, or someone gets a little bit more involved when that community doesn't exist. But there would still be the question of if there's multiple data sets out there, which one do you pick to use as the basis for CMIP? So
Yeah.
there's still that question remains.
I guess part of that decision is, I mean, like one, you know, like the pros and cons of the data set, right? Some data sets are better at other things, some things than others. And then two, the structure around the data set to be continuous, right? And like develop like a sustained mode, right? You don't want to like put all your eggs in a very like feeble basket that's going to fall apart in a year. You want to make sure that the data sets that you're choosing have like some continuity to them. Which goes back to the sustained funding and staffing issue.
And maybe part of that is you know, for any sustained data set, I think there should be some expectation of evaluation and comparison with other similar data sets, right? I mean, maybe that's
always.
something, yeah, but I think it's probably worth writing down, right? And of course, in the IAM community, that's sort of integral to the process that we go through as we compare to each other and all, you know, as part that is the process we go to try to come to some consensus on what would be reasonable scenarios for CMIP or any other scenario project.
And inventories too, as well, right? Every time you release something, you're always comparing to the other inventories out there, or should be. Um, okay, so one of the topics here was external bodies. So upstream data provision communities advocate for input data sets that are identified as at risk. Other data users, can we join forces? And can we leverage the very wide user base and reach of these data sets, and how do you organize that? So, I mean, we heard earlier at the funding panel that it wasn't really clear how impactful these data sets were. And I mean, I know that CEDS is used widely outside of CMIP. Steve, go ahead, please jump in.
No, I didn't want to interrupt. Yeah, and it made me think about how, for example, the satellite SO2 point source data set has been really important in making sure the most recent CEDS estimates are reasonable and pointing out places we need to poke into underlying assumptions, and we've been able to make improvements. And, you know, do the people that make that data set, even though I'm collaborating with them, do they fully understand how important that is to this sustain? I mean, it is actually really key for the sustained mode because it's the only real thing we have in 6-month lag time for the previous year. So, what I've been thinking is, yeah, I need to write them a note and say, by the way, this is a really important data set. Here's why. And if you ever need me or someone higher profile than me to, attest to that, to make sure it continues to happen, don't hesitate to reach out. So that's one little thing we can all do, right?
I think, Steve, on that, I was just thinking, because of these types of funders, do you not think there needs to be a kind of list of data sets, like, on, I don't know, the ESMO or the WCRP website, because I know this goes beyond CMIP as well, where they're recognised, so that it would be quite easy for providers like ESA, say, to go and search which of their data sets are coming up if they were thinking about removing a data set or changing a product, and perhaps knowing which forcing data sets are using it, because then they could get in contact. I was just thinking, is if everyone does the letters, and that is how things have been done in the past, there's always the danger that that changes with personnel rather than in the knowledge system.
Yeah.
Like, because people were talking about like with the funders want to know how users find it. The data sets are high impact, but also like it's probably both ways down from the forcing being a user to the observational community. As Bryony says, like if it's clearly mapped out, then people know what's being used by who and what the dependencies are. And I think that was discussed this morning. We need to map those dependencies.
Steve, you and I participated in a survey that talked about this exactly earlier this year. Do you remember that? We did like a little interview. Do you know who those people were?
Not remembering off the top of my head.
I am not either. So Steve and I, some people reached out to us and asked us to participate in this survey that was basically asking exactly these questions. It was like, what data are you using? How important is it? Like how integral to like making your data set or these other data sets? And they were basically just like making a database of like how important these public data sets are, which is exactly what we're talking about. And I cannot for the life of me remember what they were doing it for or who they were with. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been kind of holding back making this question because I really feel I'm not informed enough. But it just seems to me that the very same issues are being flagged by those producing the observational data sets. And, I guess it's at one level upstream. And so when we were discussing, I think it was earlier today, about publications and how to make the impact and the importance more widely known, I was just wondering if a more sort of coordinated activity is needed also with that community there. And I sort of mentioned GCOS because they're getting a bigger and bigger platform. I think they're making a lot of making themselves very visible, including in the policy spheres and I guess in the funding spheres as well. But I don't know if this is a very naive question, but it seems like, you know, joining forces here might help.
Yeah.
We've got the next one to go on to, which is system practicalities. Just before we leave that one, I was having a think. There is some work underway by CMIP7. They have been doing some interviews with people to look at the modeller's requirements from observations. So it could have been that. But I always remember Renu mentioned one of her colleagues had been assembling a kind of map at the observation modelling interface. So it could have been an activity with that. So I think it sounds to me maybe one of the take-homes for the IPO from this discussion. We've been looking at mapping the observation modelling interface. In any case, and doing some work on that, is to try and capture these activities that are happening. So then I just wanted to, you're doing really well with time, but I don't want us to forget about system practicalities. So Rachel, over to you on that, but then we will have ticked all three and then we can go back to whatever you want to discuss that you're most interested in.
Yeah, so under system practicalities, we've got how do we ensure continuity of expertise, what's needed as a minimum, the interface between research and operations mode, and how can this be managed, elements that should be common, like data format versus those that are specific, so scientific technicalities, and then some that are in the middle, like an uncertainty approach, archiving and long-term storage, equity of access considerations. Does anyone have any thoughts? I mean, I can just talk, but you're muted, Steve.
Continuity part is always important. I think that really emphasizing open source science helps guard against that, because and really, you know, maybe for sustained forcings mode, this gets back again to sort of some community peer review that, you know, the people in these discussions, if I'm looking at some other data set, even if it's a data set that I'm not, you know, intimately familiar with, but I think we can give each other comments on, okay, could someone potentially pick this up and do it? Or are there a lot of hidden assumptions or hidden files that really aren't on the GitHub repo or so on, right? I mean, I think just some emphasizing open source, having some peer review within the community certainly helps with that. But I think the other thing that can help with that is, and this is where institutions can help, and this can even help in terms of funding. So you can even think of terms of like having specific fellowship or scholarship or something, opportunities for younger scientists to participate in some of this and work on some of this. And that helps in two ways. It potentially builds skills in the you know, younger scientists. But the other thing it does, which is I think maybe more important, because a lot of younger, you know, earlier career scientists, they may work on something and then they go in a different direction, which is fine. They've learned skills, they've gone on, that's perfectly okay. But just having someone coming in and using it and coming at it fresh and using something, you really learn where you didn't document or where you forgot to upload that file or whatnot. And I think that's incredibly valuable. So, you know, this could be institutional, you know, like at a national lab, we certainly have the capability to do this. Places like CASA do this on a regular basis. So I think thinking of those opportunities can really help with this on both of those levels. And in some cases, you get somebody they're really into it and they keep at it, and you think,
Here I am
great.
10 years later.
Yeah, absolutely. Case point.
Yeah.
What were other aspects of that question?
The interface
Got
between
5
research
minutes
and
suddenly.
operations
Sorry,
mode.
sorry to interrupt, just to warn you, you've got 5 minutes, so do make sure you have time to work out the 3 key points.
Okay, yeah, let's go back to the 3. Well, okay. The other points and system practicalities were interface between research and operations mode. How do you manage this? And then elements that should be common versus those that should be specific to data sets. For kind of research versus operations mode, I feel like on SEDS we have kind of been struggling with this a little bit, with kind of finding the balance between getting out annual updates, but also improving the system and doing like big methodological changes, which is kind of prevented us from like actually doing annual updates every year. But I don't really have any comments on how to make that better, just that it's a challenge.
So I think maybe going on that, I think then it's sort of on, to some extent, on the community and the funders to help, set some of the context. Like now, if we're really, all the other data sets are coming out in sustained mode, well, we better do it too, right? And once that mentality is there, then that helps reset people's expectations a little
Yeah,
bit.
I mean, I think that this time around we like really have a better idea of like how important more frequent updates are and the extension versus the update issue than we did last time. So moving forward, I think prioritization will be a little bit different. Yeah. Okay, let's talk about our 3 key points. I have kind of 4 written down from our discussion. The first is sustained funding and staffing, and then the possibility of sharing funding and staffing. The second is how do we get from here to there? So from updating a little bit more often to like what does an actual sustained mode look like, and what are the challenges along the way that are different from the challenges of a sustained mode. And then that there should be some kind of organized effort to communicate impact of the observational data sets that we rely on. And then the fourth is that open source documentation will move towards maintaining a sustained mode and continuity.
We'll just say open source science.
Open source science. Yeah. So we're only supposed to have 3 points. So if
we can have subpoints.
Okay.
Everyone else
had like 5.
Had 5.
Okay. Yeah, Sebastian.
Just a thought on the getting from here to there, because I think if we wouldn't move to something sustained, operational, whatever we want to call it, the next logical update would probably be kind of the next round of CMIP. So in a couple of years from now. And would it make sense to define an intermediate goal to say we are not in a place to go from whatever we're doing at the moment to a next update in a year and then a year later, but say split that period to the next natural update in half and say we aim to have the next update available halfway to when we would have done it usually.
Yeah, and some organization around like the communication of like what it means to not be here where we are with no sustained mode, but also not be at a sustained mode yet.
Basically as an exercise and to test what is needed to get the next update out in say 2 to 3 years from now. Of course, that might be non-trivial from a sort of funding perspective and getting the people and so on. But that could also inform what we're missing towards a really sustained mode, because we might overlook things in this discussion.
Yeah.
It's just a thought. It might not help in any way. But then if that would become available, then we would also have to have people taking that up and using it to also test that part of the pipeline and workflow. And I think there are some of the users that are present in this workshop and Destiny among them would probably be happy to use that updated data and provide feedback.
Yeah, Sebastian, I would probably bet money that there are things we're not thinking of. So yes, I think that's a good suggestion. And I would add in there as a subpoint, one way to deal with some of these issues is sort of early career, internship, fellowship, whatever opportunities, both in terms of exposing more people to forcing data development, and also it's the best way I've ever found to test the robustness of your system. Okay,
Right.
we're losing our.
I didn't want to interrupt your flow there, Steve. We're going to move,
Yep.
physically move, but of course you can all carry on speaking. I was going to ask a clarification question with the, oh gosh, it was the one before the ECRs. So it was a panel of kind of testers, sort of users. Is that a kind of sort of early adopter user panel that's, for beta testing or something like that? Do you need a kind of consistent panel that sort of tests? It's just so that we can be a bit more coherent with our recommendations. Maybe have a think about that whilst we're moving.
I think the point was that it was really just a need for some kind of organized feedback like we do for CMIP if we're going to have an intermediate goal. Was that?
And the fresh eyes was one, that was certainly an
Yeah.
organized way to do it this time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anna, any comments from your observer status?
Nothing much more to add, no. But I mean, it seems like there are some preliminary structures that can help with this coordination, like this data task team and so on. I mean, it's the international coordination that I think is really important here.
Can I make one closing point from that, which is that the letters and the medal and the appreciation are very, very nice, and they do make a difference. But the point here is that continuity of funding trumps recognition every single time.
Well, I was also going to make the point is that, so yeah, I'm sure the letter and
Right, everyone, we're final straight. So can we just get the chairs of the breakout session 2 to just give their feedback points? Although I suspect there's more than 3 points, but that's okay. Right, who was first? Was it Helene?
Yeah, okay, so slightly disorganized, I'm afraid. I'll try and make it brief. So we talked about at the group level, we decided there were probably minimal data sets to choose from that met the requirements, but there are decisions that need to be made on those, about extensions, updates, harmonization, depending on the users. And so we talked about how we would prioritize this. Now we've been exposed to all these many users now. The suggestion was perhaps we start with the CMIP requirements, but start capturing already all the information from all the other use cases, and then maybe we can make compromises and figure out how to meet as many as possible. Anyway, there will be a much longer conversation to be had on that, I'm sure. Then we talked a bit about external bodies, about whether we needed to support all the underpinning data sets. And, of course, there's a recognition that many of those are under-recognized. So we do need to support those. We talked about maybe the data providers within the forcing data sets could perhaps make a list of what data sets they depend on. And also going the other way, who's using their data as well, apart from CMIP. We talked about what was needed by all the data set providers. So we had a long conversation about letters of support from CMIP, WCRP, medals, papers is the ultimate thing, and recognising it in the community. So so that it's seen as being a really valuable input to the whole endeavour of CMIP and much wider. So if anybody thinks I've missed anything fundamental, please chip in. No.
Carlo, you're next.
I hope I can be as disorganized as Helene, because I think it was a perfect summary. Yeah, it was very organized. Thank you, Helene. Well, actually, our conversation started from other examples. So what have been other examples of international exchange or coordination? We started from the state of the climate, WMO level, but then still looking at WMO, we looked at sort of lead center and sub-seasonal, decadal, and seasonal as being example, and what worked in that case and what didn't work. Then we moved to, I mean, one of the differences between the two examples is that in one case it's really about data and the other is more about publication, and data comes with peculiarities somehow. In terms of, then we moved a bit more into the forcing. What is specific about the forcing? How does it work? And we really try to answer the question on what are the bottleneck and what needs to happen. So one of the elements there was how do we organize this continuous mode operation versus research? And there were different opinions in the group on whether the two needs to happen very close to one another, or whether they need to be separated. And there were both arguments in favor and against that, because there is clearly a very important relationship between operation and research, and one feeding into the other. But at the same time, it was also recognized that there is a risk in terms of operation when someone gets sick or is not available. You cannot have a gap in the provision. And part of the discussion was about not only funding resources, but also the change in mentality that might be required. And I guess one important point that was raised was, and first of all, I need to thank Chris because he took notes and he's helping me delivering as disorganized as Eileen, I hope. But one of the points was about this transition. So it doesn't need to happen now. We don't need to have operation today. Is a process, and in that process, maybe having funding for development. Not research, but be something what Philip Tolkien was mentioning this afternoon. I think he was calling innovation, but the idea of something that transformed research into operation and having this funding could be an important element. And there is also this some level of ownership. So handing over something that is felt as your baby maybe is not something all organization or all provider are prepared to do. And in that sense, maybe one of the idea that came about was listing what are the top requirements in terms of forcing from the user we heard today, and what are the requirements in terms of latency, and what will be required to go into this continuous mode one by one. I think these were the key points. If you feel I missed something, please chip in.
Thanks, Carlo. And finally, Rachel was our chair for the online group.
Hi, yeah, so we started with talking at the group level, and like the other groups, we also kind of recognize that the major challenge is sustained funding and staffing for all of the data provider groups. And we talked about the potential for sharing staff and funding, and we recognize that sometimes it's easier to share funding and sometimes it's easier to share staff, but talked about the possibility of those things as one way to get around that. And then we also talked about the challenges of the transition period from whatever we're doing now to this sustained mode, and addressing kind of these challenges in the longer term sustained mode process, kind of while we're getting there, because the challenges of getting there are different coordination challenges than the challenges that we'll have when we're kind of all actually in a sustained mode. and just the general need for community coordination during this time, when we have some data sets that are doing annual updates and other data sets that are still working towards more frequent updates. And it might be helpful to define an intermediate goal for the medium term. So perhaps split the period in half between now and the next CMIP before that happens, and require some organization around that communication. So communication of the transition arrangements, improvements from existing and improvements that are envisioned for the sustained mode, and then kind of some workflow for feedback of those intermediate data sets, like we have the fresh eyes set for beta testing on the CMIP data sets. At the kind of external body level, we talked about the need for an organized effort to communicate the impact of the observational data sets that we rely on, like the other groups as well. And then at the systems practicality level, we talked about how open source science will move towards some of these challenges posed by the sustained mode. So for example, the continuity of data sets with open source documentation. And then kind of all throughout this, we talked about early career opportunities for young scientists, and how that like using early career scientists more often is a good way to work towards some of these goals. So like testing the robustness of a system for open science and open documentation, and to address some staffing problems. And if I missed anything, please online jump in.
Just one small thing we talked about a little bit earlier on about the multiple data sets. And biomass burning is one where sort of an example of that, where lots of different data sets, lots of uncertainty. So didn't really have an answer, other than the fact that if you're a data provider, certainly maybe even more so than normal in the CMIP process, we want to be seeing comparisons with other data sets. Obviously, that should be happening as a normal part of the scientific process, but we want to really make doubly sure that's happening so that we can have that learning. But it's to date, a lot of the data sets are here because someone happened to step up to produce them, and that is great. We want to recognize that, and that's sort of one of the requirements, that you need something that's sustained. So yeah, didn't really have any conclusions on that, but recognize that it's a issue.
We also, maybe because it's relevant to some of the suggestions around lots of letters, sending letters is a huge amount of use of IPO time that you might want us doing other things. So I think there's also thinking about how our fund is wanting the recognition. Is it better to have a searchable data set and that works also for the observation providers, so they can see that their data sets are being used by forcing providers? We did discuss that in the breakout groups, so perhaps thinking about something like that. I'm also going to flag something that was raised on the bus yesterday and hasn't come up so far, so a nice sort of elephant in a room to leave everyone with, but it's data licensing. You've talked a lot about, and this, just the biomass example you just now made me think about it, where there's a lot of different sort of contributors in, actually having maybe that sort of public record and recognition would also be a way to also ensure that there's been kind of informed consent towards the product being used, and then conforming to an agreed standard. The WIP use, where's Paul here? CC by 4.0. So where some input providers might not know that the end product might be that license, so you need to make sure that they're aware of it. And one of the reasons for that is so that the IPCC can use the output. So just adding that in.
I've literally just added it to the Google Doc.
Yeah, so the point of the Creative Commons licenses, basically in CMIP7, every modeling group apart from one has a CC by 4. What you're meant to do if you use those data sets is you're meant to say, thank you very much, data set provider, for providing your data. That's what you're meant to do. But no one actually enforces that, and no modeling group has an appetite to try and do that in a systematic way. The other way of doing it is NASA, who produces CCO license data, which basically says we throw NASA GIS data over the fence and we don't care what happens to it. We don't want to know whether you're using it or not. I don't think that's an ideal model. It'd be better to try and track impact of stuff. So I think CC by 4 is a good one. There are other groups that wanted to impose non-commercial licenses on things, but that is very restrictive, which means you could get left out of things like IPCC for that reason. So it's kind of a detail, but it's also a pretty relevant one to have up front when you're producing data sets. And the data providers that produce the data that those data sets are actually ingesting, which is something that we're all not really talking about very much. And I think it's Bronnie's point.
Matt?
Yeah, just a question on the recognition part. I was talking with Anna actually bilaterally on this, and I'm just curious, as part of the common nomenclature and part of ESGF, I mean, is that something that we could enforce there? Like, so every data set that's produced needs to officially recognize which data sets were used in its creation, and then we actually have a valid sort of provenance chain, and then that's also something that, as a data provider, I could then go and say, well, actually, 2,000 of the simulations used my data set, right? And so then that's a way that we could then go to a funding agency and say, you know, this is why it's important, for example.
Anything's technically possible. And I mean, one of the good things is we've got 10 forcing data sets, and we've got a lot of people in the room or online that are actually producing them. So if we can come up with a template that works for that, and we're able to kind of retrofit the fact that, you know, I'm using HAT-ISST data set and ISST data set, for example, and call that out explicitly. And if they have a license and they've got DOIs, then I put that in my documentation about my data set, then I think we've done it. And then we'd want to try and propagate that forward to the modelling groups as well. So the modelling groups then maybe cite in their papers the fact that, you know, forcing configuration X was used and here's the 10 DOIs that were used for those data sets. That would be pretty impactful, because if you think about, well, it could be quite a decent payback, actually.
Yeah, and maybe just a question to the modeling centers here, is that too onerous if that was part of the requirement for hosting your data on ESGF, that you would have to fill out all of the input DOIs that you use, for example, to make a traceable like provenance chain?
It is not too onerous for us, because we have a team of people who are looking at the individual data sets anyways. So all they would have to do is just get that DOI and put it in the document. So yeah.
I think as long as it's made easy, like some sort of bulk upload, if I have to do it through, or we have to do it through a web form individually, that's too hard. I mean, so make sure there's an API or something to make it easy to do.
There's also the issue of secondary data sets. So for example, like SEDS uses hundreds of different data sets, but like we like heavily rely on EDGAR emissions, right? So if you are using SEDS emissions and you cite SEDS, you're not necessarily citing EDGAR, which is what we're heavily relying on. And I don't know what the solution is, but it's certainly something to consider on this kind of like the secondary data sets, where it's not the forcing data sets, but they're primary data sets that go into the forcing data sets that we also need to think about.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think that this is super important. And I would argue that then when SEDS uploads to ESGF, you need to put EDGAR's DOI in, and then at some point there's a tool or utility that just walks the dependency tree and says, well, actually, of those 2,000 simulations, all of them also depended on EDGAR, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
If we were to do that, we would have to have some kind of metric for like at what point do you cite other data sets, right? Because, you know, we're citing hundreds of data sets, and it's unreasonable to load all of those DOIs in. But we would have to have some kind of agreement on like what constitutes a secondary data set to cite and what doesn't. It's just another discussion that should happen.
And not all have DOIs. Like the IEA data, oddly enough, I don't think has a DOI, right? It should.
I'd just make a point here. I mean, we're all going to have to do some work here, and I think like unreasonable, I don't think it's a reasonable word to use, to be honest. I think if we are using data sets, then we can make a good faith effort, even if it's 100 DOIs. You do it once and then you're done. I mean, you know, you would want people, if we come up with a mechanism to do it, all the modelling groups to actually point to the SEDS data set and, you know, give you fair attribution for what you guys have done. And so I think it's fair enough to think about doing that down the chain. And I mean, it would come up to everyone's discretion as to how you want to do that. You know, if it's something that you know come up with some kind of subjective call that it's not relevant, then you can stop there. But I think we all have to kind of take a responsibility on and not take an easy path out if we want to try and do this systematically.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think this is a super interesting conversation, but it also doesn't have a defined endpoint, and I'm quite conscious of time. So are there any closing comments or burning other?
I'm not sure it's a closing comment, but I can be very brief. And we do that, the DOI, we try to do the provenance within the CDS, and still the visibility of that is not what you want. So I don't think it's an either or, but I think if the goal is to increase the visibility of the work that exists and the importance it has, there are other tools that may be more effective than pushing through attribution and DOI. And like I don't know, I haven't read the paper by Gavin, but I think having an opinion piece on New York Times is way more effective than having DOI of all the data that we use cited in our paper.
Any last super burning points from anybody before we finish? Okay, in which case the meal, and with thanks to everybody who's online, there's been some